Well, gentlemen, thank you for being here with us today. Pastor Bob, Erik, great. Thank you for just again your time. I want to just open up just briefly, just kind of tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what you do currently here in the community of Kansas City.
Okay. Well, I was born and raised here in Kansas City, Missouri. Class of 1987, actually born in 1969, so really one generation removed from the civil rights movement. I went to Raytown South High School, then went on to Lincoln University by way of Penn Valley Community College, and then finishing at Central Missouri State University with a degree in history. Then I came back to Kansas City and I taught at a school for, was classified for at-risk youth, Genesis School. And part of the curriculum was showcasing African-American historic sites in the area, and I taught social studies there. So it was a student-led program, but I did a lot of the research and everything. But from that, my passion for Kansas City's Black history developed, and me being born and raised here, so it was just a natural fit. And so I've been doing tours off and on for the past 20 years and professionally for the past 11 years. So I do Bebop and Beyond, 18th Divine Walking Tour, and Streetcar KC, River City Civil Rights Tour, and Streetcar KC, a River City Mafia Tour, and also my signature tour is the Kansas City Black History Bus Tour.
Nice. Okay. Thanks.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, after pastoring at Community Christian Church for 30 and a half years, I became minister emeritus and went into kind of semi-retirement, but so as to engage in some work with the foundation. I got very, very, very lucky, very blessed to be asked to participate with the Kauffman Foundation in raising up the cause of education through community engagement. And so that's what I do. I'm a consultant with the Kauffman Foundation on public education in the larger greater Kansas City area. And so I have a lot of interesting connections and meetings and conversations on that issue. So, and I write. One of the things for me to do was that I wanted to do more of in semi-retirement was write, and so put out a couple of books since that time, and I have a couple, 3 more in the works.
Amen. Amen. And when I hear that, you are all part of this community, right? And we're talking about that. We've been talking about the last week, living into this beloved community, right? The philosophy of Dr. King's vision. And what we are looking at now is how racism can be a barrier to that, for us living into this beloved community. Tonight, we're looking at our past. And what that means is I always think it's important we have to go back and look at what racism is, how it's been embedded within our American culture, but even here within our community. As Pastor Darrell Answer said last week, he said we need to exegete our country and we need to exegete our community to find out truly who we are in order for us to get better. So that being said, Pastor Bob, I'm gonna start with you. Give us why is this important, and what can we learn about our past when it comes to racism?
Oh, sure. Well, I think that surely somebody said this before I did in your program and in your classes, but racism is the original sin of our country, and unless we address it, we can't be redeemed. It permeates and suffuses so much of what happens all across the country with regard to outcomes for healthcare, with regard to segregation achievements, with regard to education achievements. The segregated character of almost every metropolitan area of our country and every state leads us to an unavoidable fact. If we don't deal with racism, we will not be healed as a country, and we cannot be all that we could be as a country. So the promise of America is equality and equity. We saw in the civil rights movement some movement towards equality. But what is coming to the fore now, especially in the Black Lives Movement and especially in the COVID-19 crisis, is the need for equity, 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 equity across the country. But let's start right here in Kansas City. So I applaud Church of the Resurrection for taking up this timely issue and this absolutely essential topic.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Erik, can you give us a little history when we talk about racism here within our own hometown, Kansas City? What has that what does that look like? You know, because I've only lived up here for 3 years, so I'm still exegeting, you know,
Okay.
my community, right? So I want to learn more. So what do we need to know about how we can continue to counter and move forward when we're talking about racism in our own community?
Well, when you look at the Shakespearean play Othello, Othello he was a Moor, he was a black Moor. So in the 1500s, 1600s, there was no concept of race, even in Europe. Okay, so blacks were able to rise in high ranks of nobility. You have blacks that are kings in Europe. You had the Moors that ruled Spain for over 700 years, up until the time of Christopher Columbus. But so at Christopher Columbus, though, you have the transatlantic slave trade that took place, and you have Spain and Portugal being the first countries to go into West Africa and take slaves from the west, take Africans from the west coast of Africa, and we were dispersed in Brazil. A third of the slaves were actually taken to Brazil, and then you have slaves that were taken to the West Indies, and then you have also slaves that were taken along the southeastern seaboard of the United States for the purpose of producing cotton. But you know, a lot of European nations converged on Africa and exploited the continent. But so here around 1619, the first slaves reach Virginia, and then around 1793, there's a slave revolt that takes place in Haiti. And so led by Toussaint Louverture, Henry Christophe, and John Dessalines. And then from that point, that's when Haiti, at the same time, there was a French possession, and the French also occupied this area as well of Louisiana. And Kansas City was part of Upper Louisiana. And so the first slaves in this area were actually probably more than likely taken from Haiti, and they were brought here for the purpose of extracting minerals out of the mines, like in the Boot Hill of Missouri. And those slaves more than likely spoke French, which is the language of their masters. But they had codes that governed the relationship. So there could only be so many blacks at one time in a group, codes like that. But they weren't as strict as what was to come later on during slavery. But after that slave revolt, France was at the same time about to go to war with Great Britain. And so they needed to fund the war. So that's when they sold the territory of Louisiana to America. Thomas Jefferson was president, and he appointed that was for $15 million. And then he appointed Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, and they set forth on the Lewis and Clark expedition. And then you have settlers that started coming to the area. But that was around 1803. But around 1793, you have the invention of the cotton gin. And then like 30 years before, you have this whole concept of race, where it is actually Carl Linnaeus, was a botanist. He classified plants, and he also classified people. Then another scientist, and that was in the 1730s. Then around the 1750s, another scientist by the name of Bloomberg, he then gave a hierarchical, he classified race, but he made it hierarchical in nature, meaning he ranked whites first, then he went on down into a ranking system that listed blacks as down at the bottom. But it was right before the Industrial Revolution. So with the invention of the cotton gin, you have mass productions of cotton and the need for more slave labor. So racism was used as a means to justify the exploitation of one group of people, meaning African slaves, for the purpose of exploiting their labor. And cotton at that time, and it wasn't just cotton, it was cotton was the main crop that made America the world economic power that it is today. But there was also rice, there was also tobacco and hemp. Here in this area, they did not grow cotton, only in the Boot Hill. In this area, they grew hemp and tobacco. So Missouri came into the Union right around this time as a slave state, 1820. 1820, 1821, the Missouri Compromise. And at that time, they needed to bring the state in with the compromise because they needed to maintain the balance of powers in the House of Representatives because it's based upon population. And slaves counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of taxation and representation in the House of Representatives. So that's why a compromise was made where Missouri came into the Union as a slave state, Maine came in as a free state. That was the Missouri Compromise. Then in 1831, you have Andrew Jackson signing the Indian Removal Act, which moved the Indians west. So you have the Wyandot Indian and the Shawnee. They were relocated here from the Ohio River Valley. And the Shawnee were brought into the Shawnee Indian Mission, which was established by the Reverend Thomas Johnson in Fairway, Kansas. And by the way, he owned slaves in the territory of Kansas. And they were brought there and they were westernized so that they could assimilate into the larger majority society. So they had to cut their hair, they had to change the food that they ate and couldn't speak in their native tongue. And then you have the Wyandot that were given the land for relocating. And they were given what's the area known as Kansas City, Kansas. So around 1854, Missouri, 1847, Missouri passed a law that made it illegal to teach blacks, slave or free, how to read. And they could not hold a church service without whites being present. And that was because they feared slave revolts like that happened in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831. Nat Turner, he led a slave revolt with the inspiration that slaves were actually the descendants of the Hebrews in the Bible, and Egypt symbolized America. And so with that inspiration, he led a slave revolt that killed over 60 whites. Denmark Vesey, he was inspired by the same story in the Bible. And so that's why they made it illegal to teach blacks, slave or free, how to read, and they could not hold a church service without whites being present. And then, and that was in 1847. In 1854, you have Kansas has enough people in its territory to apply to the Union to become a state, but the question is whether it be a free state or a slave state, because Missouri slave owners did not want to be at risk to the slaves having the opportunity to cross over into Kansas where they would have the perception of being free. When I say perception, just because they made it over into Kansas does not mean that they couldn't be caught and brought back over to their slave master. And so slave patrollers would hide along the banks of the Missouri River to catch runaway slaves in their attempt to cross over into Kansas or maybe also into Quindaro. Everyone has heard of the Jayhawks. And so on tours, I often ask people, has anyone, who's seen a Jayhawk? And somebody, and I just want to see who's going to say, I have, but they don't exist. But so it's kind of a cruel joke that I do on my tours. But they were slave abolitionists, and they came here to stop the expansion of slavery. So they formed a partnership with the Wyandot Indian, and they allowed their land to be used as a port of entry for those people that wanted Kansas to come into the Union as a free state. So you have slaves, they would actually wait for the Missouri River to freeze, and they would try to cross over into Kansas where they would have the perception of being free, but they could always be caught and brought back. But so the Civil War has its beginnings here with Kansas being referred to as Bleeding Kansas, and John Brown and the Kansas Jayhawks and the Confederate Bushwhackers, Frank James. So it's a whole nother story with that. But after the Civil War, we received the rights to the Hannibal Bridge, which was the first bridge to cross the Missouri River. And blacks lived where they actually helped build the bridge, and they lived in the West Bottoms on the east side in a section known as Hell's Half Acre. And blacks and whites lived there in that area. Okay, and so blacks and whites lived amongst each other and other ethnic groups up until Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, which separated the races. And so that's when you have blacks being confined to certain areas. So, and primarily blacks live they live south of the Missouri River and north of 21st Street between Benton and Troost. Typically. Then there were small pockets of blacks that lived in Leeds. Also, you have Westport, and you also have Dupreece Village. But so there are small pockets of blacks that live, that are scattered throughout greater Kansas City, and also Independence, Missouri as well. You have a section of blacks that lived, it was called the Neck, where blacks in Independence lived. But anyway, primarily between the Missouri River and 21st Street, between Benton and Troost. So everything was segregated. So primarily, you have blacks that lived on 12th Street and 18th Street were the main two streets. So blacks that lived around 12th Street got all their goods and services from 12th Street. Blacks that lived on 18th Street pretty much got everything they needed on 18th Street. Then there were institutions that provided a bridge between two communities, like the Wheatley Provident Hospital. At one point in time, there was only one hospital in Kansas City, in the Kansas City area. When I say Kansas City area, I mean Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri, and that was Douglas Hospital over in Kansas City, Kansas. Then there was a major flood that took place in 1903, which like and so it became apparent that blacks nor Hispanics had any place to go to receive adequate medical attention. And so that prompted J.E. Perry, who had came here to this area after having fought in the Spanish-American War. And he served as a doctor in the war. And he came to Kansas City and he married Frederica Sprague, who's actually a granddaughter of Frederick Douglass. But he started Perry Sanitarium on 12th and Vine. And then later, with the help of private funding, both black and white, you have Wheatley Provident Hospital that was established in 1826. No, I'm sorry, around 1914 at 1826 Forest. You also have, so institutions were established to maintain segregation, like Wheatley Provident Hospital, Paseo YMCA, and these institutions were funded by blacks and whites. You also have in 1893, you have our Parks and Boulevard system being established. And it was designed by George Kiesler. And George Kiesler, that same year, he went to the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Illinois. And at that exposition, there was a city design that was displayed known as White City. And White City created natural barriers between the haves and the have-nots through the parks and the boulevard system. And from that inspiration, he came back to Kansas City and he designed our parks and boulevards system. So you have the parks were used to create natural barriers between the haves and the have-nots. And there's still apparent, so say like if you're behind the Nelson Art Gallery, those homes behind the Nelson Art Gallery, then there's a park. There's Gillum Park right behind those homes. And so Gillum Park is a barrier between those homes behind Nelson Art Gallery, which were a higher caliber home or higher value perceived, as opposed to the homes on the other side of the park, which is one of the more obvious barriers. Also, you have Spring Valley Park and Cruz Park over on 27th and Brooklyn. One park, Cruz Park, was for blacks or coloreds, and then you have the Spring Valley Park, which was for whites at the time. But those two parks were placed side by side to create a natural boundary between blacks, well, haves and have-nots, and then also blacks and whites. And so you also have Paseo was established at that point as well. But then racism was has a way of being embedded psychologically. And it goes down for generations and generations and generations. In 1904, at the St. Louis Fair, it was the Louisiana Exposition. It was honoring the Louisiana Purchase. And they actually had a human zoo there. And George Kessler, he designed the landscape for the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. And they actually had taken a tribe from the Congo, and they had uprooted them and brought them to St. Louis for the fair. And the way the exposition was designed, the way the display was designed, is that it was actually down in a valley, so you actually look down on this tribe. So it's a subconscious way that racism has been ingrained into society. And even in 1904, the blacks in St. Louis weren't even allowed to go to the fair. And so those subtle things, which have been part of our infrastructure, have played a part in where we are today. But understand that it was a cultural construct to justify the exploitation of one group by another. So up until 1948, those lines that I mentioned, south of the Missouri River, north of 21st Street, between Troost and Benton, were pretty much they were rigidly enforced, even up into the 50s. But there was a case in 1948, the Shelley case out of St. Louis, Missouri, where they began to no longer enforce restrictive covenants. But they had been perpetuated throughout Kansas City with, J.C. Nichols, the Country Club Plaza, the Country Club District, which he designed, Prairie Village, Ward Parkway, Crestwood, mentioned the Country Club Plaza, and with that, he, along with William Rockhill Nelson, were the first people to buy property beyond Brush Creek, because the city at one point in time did not go beyond Brush Creek, and so they could determine the use of the land. And so with the properties that he bought and sold, the deeds attached to them contain restrictive covenants that stated if you purchase this property, you cannot rent or sell to a Negro or a Jew. Now, blacks could entertain in the Country Club Plaza, like Charlie Parker. He actually performed where the Fogo de Chao is now. Charlie Parker performed at a cafe there. So you could perform there, but you could not dine there, you could not shop there. But that was maintained all the way up until the 1940s with that Shelley case out of St. Louis. And then Santa Fe neighborhood began, and that was located right there. It begins at 27th in Indiana and goes to like 31st in Prospect. But the Santa Fe historic neighborhood was one of the first areas that blacks began to move to beyond those boundaries that were originally set for them. Also, as far as public facilities were concerned, you had the parks. And so even though blacks were paying for the swimming pool, because it's a city park, paying for the swimming pool, the golf courses. They had Swope Park Memorial Golf Course #1 and another golf course #2. And the Swope Memorial Golf Course #1 was designed by Tillinghast in like 1933. They'd have PGA tournaments and everything. It was a public funded park, but it was ran like a social club for white men. Blacks weren't allowed to go there. The swimming pool. It was in 1951 that Thurgood Marshall tried the Swope Park swimming pool desegregation case 3 years prior to Brown versus Board of Education. It was a federal case that took place here in Kansas City, and the federal courts ruled in favor of Thurgood Marshall. And Swope Park shut the swimming pool down during the appeal process for 3 years because they didn't want blacks and whites swimming amongst each other for fear of a race riot, because that's what happened in St. Louis, Missouri, when they integrated Fairground, I believe it's Fairground Park in St. Louis, Missouri. There was a race riot erupted around 2 years prior to, and even like around 1917, a black youth was swimming in Chicago and swam was in Lake Michigan of Chicago, in the Chicago area. He swam in the wrong section and was stoned, drowned. A race riot erupted. So it's always been swimming pools had always been a real touchy subject. But so after that, after Brown versus Board of Education, you have what is called white flight, and that even took place even prior to with the around 1948, and where you have block busting, where if a black person moved on a block that was primarily all white, the real estate agent would go around and he would actually move a black person on that block, direct him to that block, and then once he moved on that block, he would go around to the neighbors and say, "Hey, a black person just moved on your block, so the value of your home is going to go down." So he would scare homeowners into selling their home at a lower price. Then they would turn around and inflate that price to black people coming into the area. And then when black people tried to get loans on their homes in order to improve their homes, their loans were denied because it was in a red line area, because those houses and those homes were overvalued. And so so you have the neighborhoods, and you also have the schools, a direct mirror of what those neighborhoods that those schools serve. So like Paseo High School so I have an uncle who went to Paseo High School. He started in like 1965. When he started at Paseo, the school was 75, 85% white, mostly white. But then by the time he graduated, it had flipped. So the school was all black. And then, but within a matter of 4 years. So also, there were, between 1969 and 1989, there were measures that were put on the ballot to increase funding within the Kansas City, Missouri School District, and those measures were voted down. And so, as a result, the school district was left in disrepair. Windows were falling out the panes. The halls reeked of urine. There were rodents all throughout the schools and everything, and they began. And so, also, along with that, you have crack cocaine being targeted into the black community as well, which we are still reeling and staggering from that because that took out generations. And that's something that I was able to see in the 1980s, was the demise of the black community through crack cocaine that was targeted within the black community. And a lot of people don't talk about how drugs, even going back to the mafia, how they actually targeted the black community and said, okay, this is where we're going to sell drugs. They did no other community like that. No other ethnic group or any group, period, where they said, okay, we're going to outline this area, we're going to sell drugs. And it was done even going back to the Pendergast political machine. That's why 12th Street became so notorious, because it was so vice-filled with, if you wanted drugs, if you wanted to buy a prostitute, or where you knew exactly where to go. It was quarantined in that area. And so these are the things that have impacted the black community, and they're impacting us today, even with the violence, because it wasn't just drugs that were put into our community. You also have guns as well. So we are still reeling with it. And then when you couple with the fact with the school to prison pipeline, and how America, and how prisons are privatized, and how America imprisons more of its own people than any other country in the world. So slavery has not gone anywhere. After the end of the Civil War, you had that time period known as Reconstruction. And so you had the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, except in the event that you commit a crime. So you could still be re-enslaved even today, and it's manifested through the criminal justice system. Then you had the 14th Amendment, which was equal protection of the law, but that's not always realized through the apparent attacks of police brutality upon black people each and every day with the George Floyd incidents. So that's not being realized. So we understand now that a law is no good if it's not enforced. And then you have the 15th Amendment, which gave blacks the right to vote, except in the event that you're a convicted felon. But once you're no longer on probation or parole, you can have your voting rights restored. So, but a lot of the things that we're going through today, they're recycling, like the incarceration rate, the murder rate, and we just need to bring value back to black life, and I think that's becoming a theme now. But it needs to be something that, you pray on truth, then you also pay on truth too, and you support black businesses as well. So that's where we're at in order to bring about equity. But I think the conversations need to begin to become more and more, popular conversations about race, so that we understand that its use, it was a cultural construct to justify the exploitation of one group by another. Yeah. You cannot put a man in any racial classification, because you run out of classifications. A Mexican and a Japanese can have a child together. What race is that person? It just doesn't make any sense. So it's a cultural construct. Yeah. And so once we understand that, we can remove that barrier. But you have to understand that, it's been psychologically ingrained. When someone got lynched, it was an event. It was a poster. We're going to lynch, so they knew about it. And you planned around that with thousands and thousands of people. Like, people go to a football game, back in the 1930s when Raymond Gunn out of Maryville, Missouri was lynched because it was alleged that he raped a white teacher. You had like 2,000 to 3,000 people that showed up in Maryville to watch a black person get chained to the roof and to the roof of a school, and they set the school on fire. And the National Guard, everybody knew about it before it happened, and everybody showed up to it like it was a football game. People took pictures around it. And so that is embedded in, these are people that took their kids to this. So what are they going to teach their kids?
Yeah.
But it was a movement to dehumanize a group of people to justify, and it was carried out through all aspects of life. It was carried out through popular culture, through the perpetuation of stereotypes, you know, and it's carried out through the movies today, like a movie like Menace to Society. Give you an example of how it was perpetuated through American society. Al Jolson, in 1927, he was considered the world's greatest entertainer. Okay, he was a Jew, okay, white Jew, whatever. And so, but he performed in blackface. He performed jazz singer. It was the first major motion movie with sound and everything because they had graduated from the silent screen cinema and all that. So, but he performed in blackface. And he perpetuated the racist stereotypes that have governed us for decades, ever since around 1750, 1780, when they needed a justification for that. But it was throughout every aspect of life through popular culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You had the minstrel shows and all that and everything. Movies like King Kong.
Yeah.
So, but this is what we have to deconstruct, and we do that through conversations, and we look at history to find out how we got to that point. But it was a cultural construct.
Yeah.
That was a man-made myth.
When we talk about our history, right, this can, you know, I remember learning some things that I didn't learn in high school and even working on in my bachelor's, right? And some of that stuff can be hard to hear and even understand, right? When I came out here, I was always told that there was a historical dividing line, and it's truths, it's on truths, right? And so as the church, as we continue to live in this beloved community, what does the church need to know? You know, if you could sum it up in as living in these unprecedented times as we move forward,
right? What
does the church need to know about, our history, but more importantly, how can we continue to counter that? If we can kind of sum that up.
Sure.
Yeah.
You want to take a stab at that first?
Well, I think the church needs to know the truth, and that can be subjective, but I think it's just seek the truth, really, and cross-reference. Don't take one person's word, but research for yourself. But I think just by seeking the truth as to actually what happened, maybe we can begin to gain some ground. But I think, and you can make an active, you can take an active role in leveling the playing field with patronizing black businesses. I think that's one of the main ways in order to kind of level the playing field and bring about some equity. And I just, so that's one way.
Yeah.
I think that is one way. And we didn't get here overnight, so it's kind of hard to come up with a possible solution, but I would, or a solution that fits everything that we're going through now, but I would say that we seek the truth as to how we got to where we are today, and that it's up to, and it can be subjective. It's definitely subjective, but understand the whole truth and understand both sides of it. But if we look at our history, it will point us in the right direction. It will, but only certain histories, certain things are taught in school. We were just, as we were talking, like, you're from Oklahoma, and there was a lot of stuff that you just weren't taught, even though it was Oklahoma history.
Right. I didn't learn about the Tulsa race riots until I got into my grad work.
Right.
So, yeah, absolutely.
And so, and and the truth is way more compelling than a lie. It really is, because it's actually happened. You just can't imagine if some of the people would do some of the things they do. But I just think that by looking at our history and go to the museums. If you go to the museums in Europe, you'll see black Madonnas. You'll see, black royalty. Yeah. So how all of a sudden did this switch?
Yeah.
And you look at, when did racism come about and around that time frame? And so right around the Industrial Revolution, when they needed a free labor source in order to maximize capitalism, they looked. It was easy, because see, at first the first slaves were actually you had indentured servants. So you have whites. So the whole concept of slavery has been around for hundreds, thousands. I mean, not hundreds, thousands, but for years, for years. And so, but that concept of the transatlantic slave trade being coupled with the Industrial Revolution and the need to exploit labor just led to racism, and everything just kind of expanded from that.
Yeah.
And so now it's more of an exploitation of the poor by the rich, and blacks just happen to kind of fall in line. Yeah. I was doing some research on the Iran-Contra scandal, and Gary Webb, he wrote this story. I forgot the name of the documentary, but anyway, he wrote for the Mercury News, and he said, well, the CIA never targeted the black community to sell drugs, but they didn't have to, because the infrastructure was already there. They needed, when I say it was already there, it was just already there, from the schools to the social economic level, and to everybody, the way everybody was living. You didn't have to target it. They wanted to sell drugs quickly. They knew exactly where to go. Yeah. So it was not something hard, because the infrastructure, it was already laid out.
Right. Right. Pastor Bob, how would you answer that question?
Well, you want to have a friend like Erik Stafford, and you want to listen a long time. And you want to read books, and you want to partake of popular media and enrich yourselves and be inspired. The part of the history that I think is astounding, I only learned it in the last couple of years, is that when the Board of Brown versus the Board of Education ruling came down in '54, that our leaders here in Kansas City began saying, wow, we're going to need a bigger tax base, because we're going to have some people leaving Kansas City. So that's when the expansion of Kansas City began to explode. And so we became, I think, outside of Jacksonville, the largest. We're larger than Houston, land-wise. We're a bigger city than Houston, Texas. And we have probably 1/4 the population. But we began buying parcels and parcels and parcels of land, except, or in response to which, in '57, the State House made it okay that as pieces of land and property and communities got annexed into Kansas City, the school districts could opt out of being annexed into Kansas City public schools. And so that's why you have all of these little patchwork of school districts all over Kansas City.
And it decentralized the tax base.
Yeah, and so all the people who lived in Kansas City, when a bond issue came up to support the schools, they weren't sending their kids to Kansas City public schools. They voted the bonds down. Right. Again and again and again and again. So this is much by design, all right?
Yeah. And they did it for over 20 years.
So we need to know our history. Just like Erik said, you need to have a friend like Erik. You also need to understand that this is going to take on Robert Putnam's great book that was a follow-up to Bowling Alone. Bowling Alone was his sociological analysis of how we're becoming more privatized, more insular, more separated. And then he wrote a follow-up book. It was a kind of antidote book, and he said we're better together. We really are richer together. Any preacher who wants to really know the richest repository of wisdom, practices, and varieties of preaching needs to partake of the African American preaching tradition, because it is probably the most beautiful, most enriched, most fertile ground of preaching possibilities. So why don't white preachers, Latino preachers, understand the black pulpit? Much better. You'll be a better preacher by it. If we know each other better, we'll produce better poems, theater, art, communities, schools, businesses. If we're not afraid of going over to Truce to pray, we don't have to be afraid to go over to Truce to eat, to buy, to purchase. And so that was what was so kind of amazing to me last Friday when praying on Truce happened. I mean, I drove down about 6 blocks before I could really find a parking space, saw some friends, and we stayed socially distanced. And unlike today, we had our mask on. And I'll have my mask on after I leave today. But we were socially distanced, we were safe, we were protective of each other. And then across the mask, there were words: reconciliation, love, hope, racial justice. Again, and we saw some Church of the Resurrection people there too. It was great to see them. So that stretched up and down the 10 miles of Truce. To echo what Erik just said a minute ago, if we can pray on Truce, we can also pay on Truce, and that would be a big, big, big impact for the city. One of the things I think that you have to prepare for is to lose. You're going to lose some battles. You're not going to win them all. Just like Erik said about Thurgood Marshall trying one case in 51 and then another one in 54 3 years later. Well, Thurgood Marshall was a part of a process. Mordecai Wyatt Johnson in 1926 became the first African-American president of Howard University. He looked at the school and said, I need to raise a lot of money, all presidents do, and I need to increase the power and the effectiveness of the lawyers who come out of our law school. So he hired a man named Charles Hamilton Houston to be the dean of the law school, and they went into a great effort to make this a really fully accredited law school, which they did. 1930, they had their first class of about 25, 30 students. 3 years later, that graduating class had 7 graduates. The valedictorian, the top of the class, was Thurgood Marshall. And then 21 years later, finally, they had a case in the Supreme Court that outlawed segregation of public education was illegal and against our basic tenets and principles as a country. That's what I call strategic visionary hopefulness. And strategic visionary hopefulness is not for the faint of heart. It's not for everybody, but it needs to be more and more a part of churches so that you're planning and planting seeds for the future that eventually do take root and expand and make equality and equity real.
Yeah. I was, as we opened up with Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, basically to summarize his words, silence is not an option anymore for the church, right? And as we want to continue to live into this beloved community, I think that's, what we're seeing today, and I don't know, you all tell me, what we're seeing right now, right, is that we're having to battle this virus of racism within our country, within our cities, right? But we're also stuck in this pandemic, right? So it's forcing us really, because there's really nothing going on. We can't do anything, right? Gradually, slowly, businesses are opening up, but we're having to look at ourselves, we're having to look at our communities, we're having to look at our country for what it is. And more importantly, to what you all are saying, how can we go forward, right? And really plant these seeds for the future.
We have a lot of time on our hands. I think it's actually a good time for reflection, self-examination. Do what Ignatius said, an examine, kind of a soulful probing of the depths of our personality and our commitments, and saying, what do I stand for? In a document I put together a couple weeks ago called What Can We Do? One of the things that I think that we really can do is look and see, how do I want to be remembered when my grandchildren ask me what I did during this time? What do I want to say to them? What do I want to be ready to say? I did this. Tino, you're going to be able to say, I produced a class called Living into the Beloved Community. And out of that came XYZ, these things. Beautiful things to contribute to the growth in your own church and as an example to other congregations. What do we want our grandchildren to hear from us when they ask us that question? What did you do after George Floyd was murdered? What was your response? What did your congregation do? What did you do in the community? How was it to live back then? And what did you do while you were at home quarantined because of COVID-19?
Yeah, now is a perfect opportunity to educate yourself.
Yeah. So I think I'll leave it at that. And so, hey, I'm grateful for the both of you. Thank you very much for spending your time with us, and thank you for giving us history. Erik, I know that one way that we can continue to learn is by taking your tours. Right?
But you can go to www.kansascitytourcompany.com. And Kansas City Tour Company is all spelled out.
Awesome. I'll be up there taking one for sure. So
okay.
Thank you again, Erik. Pastor Bob, thank you again. God bless
Always.
you. Bless you.
Thank you.
All right.